Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to TCB Talks, the business of hemp. I'm Allison Kaplan, editor-in-chief of Twin Cities Business. Thanks for joining us this afternoon to talk about the recent and somewhat surprising change in Minnesota's hemp laws and what it means for business. We've got a great panel of industry experts who are on the front lines of all aspects of the hemp industry. They're here to talk about what the changes mean for business and what comes next for those of you looking to get involved. If you're joining us live today, feel free to use the comment section on your screen to pose questions. We promise we'll get to as many of them as we can. Well, let's do it. Let's meet our experts. Come on, everybody, and join me. Hello, hello. Well, let me introduce you to our esteemed panel today. At least in my upper left corner, we have Tony Cordelette. He is the weed scientist he has served as weed scientist with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture since 1998. He currently supervises the noxious weed and industrial hemp programs. He has 30 years of professional experience working with plant species, habitat management, ecological preservation. And in 2010, due to his plant sciences background, he was appointed as the MDA's representative for both industrial hemp and medical cannabis by this Commissioner of Agriculture. He's getting a lot of questions right now, you guys, and we're really glad to have him with us today to answer some of ours. Thanks for being here, Tony.
Yes, thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Nicola Peterson as CEO of Verist LLC. We'll talk a lot about Verist today, but you might know her also from the other hat she wears with Seavers Family Farm, where she heads up marketing, hiring staff, making payroll, bookkeeping, planning, completing all the day-to-day operations. She wears countless hats and has proven her experience running and marketing a business. Nicola and her husband, Aaron Peterson, started Verist in 2021. Verist CBD products are grown on a multi-generational farm made with safe, all-natural ingredients and third-party tested for quality, accuracy, and the ideal mix of cannabinoids. She's learned a lot in the last year, I know, and even more so. We'll talk more about that today. Hello, Nicola. Next, Jason Tarasik. He is the founder of Minnesota Cannabis Law. He founded it in 2018 to serve the hemp, cannabinoid, medical marijuana, and adult use marijuana markets in the upper Midwest. During the spring of 2022, Jason successfully lobbied in favor of Minnesota's THC-infused edible law. Jason has more than 20 years of legal experience as a transactional attorney and litigator. He's been named to the list of super lawyers, which is an honor bestowed on only the top 5% of attorneys in Minnesota. Previously, Jason served as the Minnesota political director for the Marijuana Policy Project. In this role, he helped draft legislation to legalize recreational marijuana for adults in Minnesota. He's also the co-founder of Minnesotans for Responsible Marijuana Regulation, a multi-partisan advocacy group that presses for marijuana legalization in Minnesota. He's the go-to guy. Thanks for being here, Jason.
My pleasure.
Next, we have Tom Weisenand of Indeed Brewing. As CEO and co-founder, Tom is a leader inside and outside of the brewery. He manages Indeed's production teams, expansion plans, and finances. In light of the new legislation, Indeed Brewing launched its first cannabis-infused beverage, Too Good, a non-alcoholic THC seltzer. And boy, did he generate a lot of press in doing so. They were very quick on the scene. Outside of the brewery, Tom is an avid world traveler, a private pilot, and an outdoor enthusiast. I'm excited to talk about his experiences delving into this THC world today. Last but not least, I'm delighted to introduce you all to Winter Kiefer, who joined Twin Cities Business as an associate editor this past January. She has been reporting reporting on the state's law change around THC since it was first passed. She didn't know that she was coming to us to become our hemp reporter, but boy, has she ever risen to the occasion. Born and raised in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Winter covered multiple communities across the Great Lakes states. And after residents legalized recreational marijuana via referendum in 2018. So she's had some experience with this topic. She also covered crime in courts, education, and community politics for the Flint Journal. We're so delighted to have her on staff and delighted to have her today to share some of her experiences and ask some questions as well. Well, long way of saying we have quite the panel and we're excited to dive in. Tony, let's start with you if we could. What question would you say you are getting most frequently right now from businesses regarding the new hemp law?
I think that for our perspective, there's still a lot of confusion as to, what has happened. And, for the hemp world, the session passed this law, right into June. By then, our farmers were already licensed and growing, or at least planting. I think a lot of folks held back this year from getting licensed just because there was no way forward for this. And with the Delta 8 products that had started proliferating the market, really nationwide, 2 years ago, it started to really come on the radar and then really got, more pronounced last year. Then it kind of started forcing departments of health and agriculture through the food safety programs and whatnot to looking into, these products, whereas they were kind of ignored up until then, at least in Minnesota. And so a lot of growers saw that there was an increase in that and they didn't want to take those risks. They really didn't know where the law, kind of settled with kind of getting into this type of a business. So with the updates to Minnesota Statute 15172, which allowed for the creation of edible cannabinoid products, I think there's still, I don't know if we've gotten a lot of questions about the law per se from our growers, more so than we have from regulators and health professionals, and a lot of concern from parents and other folks out there that are just kind of trying to figure out what has happened. There wasn't a lot of talk about it leading up to the passage, at least in the general public. I think the folks within the industry knew and expected something to happen. We certainly did on the regulatory side, but because there really isn't a regulatory map going forward for the overall processing of these products, that's really where we're getting questions right now. And we're getting ready to open our licensing up for 2023. So I'm expecting those questions to increase quite a bit over the next month or two.
Very interesting. Jason, let's go to you next. What do you think currently is the biggest misunderstanding about what has happened so far with the new legislation?
Well, I mean, Anthony Cordelette just used the word confusing. Yes, I think everyone was very confused initially as to what exactly was happening. And I have a network of cannabis lawyers I speak with across the country, and they didn't quite know what to make of us because we don't really fit in a box they've known before. Usually you're an adult use marijuana state or you're not. It's sort of a toggle one way or the other. And we've really created this new thing. And we are now this hemp-derived THC edible market that doesn't really exist anywhere else. So I think a lot of people, frankly, were just confused as to what exactly was happening. Certainly, the insiders knew exactly what was going on, but it took a while for the public to realize it. It wasn't until some of the major media, I think in the Twin Cities, started running these stories that it started to sink in with people that, no, this is really happening. And certainly when everybody woke up one day and saw the line snaking around the block at Nothing But Hemp in St. Paul, they said, oh, okay, this really is happening. So, hemp-derived THC is the same as chemically as marijuana-derived THC. And I think that may have been confusing to a lot of people too. It's the same stuff. So for those of us like me who have been pushing for adult use marijuana, it's certainly a big step forward towards that.
But maybe not the step that you had expected. I guess the question is, should we feel proud that we're doing it differently in Minnesota, or just be kind of embarrassed, or like, what are we doing?
Well, you were listing off some of the things I've been a part of. I'm in favor of responsible regulation, a responsible market. There really is no regulation around this right now. There really is no licensing. I'm hopeful that when the legislature reconvenes in January, that we'll put some more guardrails on this, because right now it really is the Wild West, because anyone can jump into this market, anyone can sell it. A lot of my clients, quite frankly, are a little miffed because they're following the law, but maybe the smoke shop down the street isn't. And it doesn't seem fair to them that, they are taking consumer safety seriously, and perhaps somebody isn't. So we need to tighten that up, I think, for the benefit of the public at large and consumers and the industry too.
Right, makes sense. Tom and Nicole, I'm really interested in what your experience was when this law change happened. I know for us in the newsroom, Winter was the one who was kind of piecing it together and saying, wait a minute, look at what just happened. And maybe she can talk a little bit more about that. What was it like for you, Tom? We'll go to you first. Tom, did you recognize right away, wow, we could get into production now?
Yeah, we've been monitoring it. I mean, we had done a CBD infused non-alcoholic beverage, launched that back in 2020, I believe it was, called Lull, and we ran that for a while until we basically were told by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture that CBD was not an approved food ingredient in Minnesota based on their interpretation. So we stopped making that product. But in the process of creating that product, we had developed this idea of, well, hey, maybe someday there will be a level of legal cannabis in Minnesota, whether it be CBD or THC, whether it be hemp-derived or marijuana-derived, and knew that we could, basically pivot and create a beverage. So we were a little surprised, though. We thought that there was going to be some movement on CBD in this last session and then turn into law, but it ended up being THC, and that's quite the change from just CBD. And so while we were kind of a little surprised, it didn't take us long to get in a meeting room and put a plan together to create a beverage to share with the public. So.
Nicola, what about for you? You haven't even been in the CBD business that long, and then along comes this change. What did it mean for Verist?
For us, like Jason said, hemp-derived THC really is no different than regular THC. So being a hemp grower, for us, it was really adding another SKU to what was already our established CBD line. It wasn't that big of a pivot. We had heard rumblings in the legislature that this may be coming down the pipeline. And so, being a hemp grower and having a CBD line, we always kind of in the back of our head think about when adult use legalization happens in our state. We do think it is inevitable that it will happen. And so pivoting relatively quickly, and Tom kind of touched on it, was relatively easy, and then I suppose that's a perk of being a family farm and a small business. To be able to pivot quickly is an advantage. We don't have all the advantages, but that is one of them. So it really was just adding another product line that we think people in Minnesota want.
Right. It seems like, and I'm noticing even in the questions that people are starting to post in our Q&A and our chat, and thank you, keep them coming. There is still some confusion about the difference between hemp-derived THC and regular THC. Are they the same? You've said that they are. Some people think they aren't. Tony, that seems like one that maybe you could take a stab at.
Yeah, there's no difference. And you're right, there's confusion, and that's the frustrating. There's a lot of confusion on part of policyholders. So they seem to think that hemp is safe, and therefore, hey, we can easily pass this law on, oh, if that THC comes from hemp, it's safe. They don't understand the chemistry. THC is THC. And as everyone said here, essentially what has happened, although yes, it is essentially an adult use world now for certain products, what they've done by regulating it to hemp, which other states have haven't done, when you open it to an outright adult use program, you're allowing for the growth of marijuana, so high THC content plants in an agronomic setting. Minnesota hasn't done that. You still have to grow hemp in the plant form, so we're not going to have fields of marijuana out there. That means my department and my unit, which specifically focuses on the production of plants, hemp plants in particular, we're going to be out testing. Those fields have to pass. That means they have to be below that number that was chosen, 0.3%, by dry weight, and be considered hemp. So, be that as it may, some folks on the public safety side of things think that that's a win to some degree. And there is a lobby now from what I would call more industrial uses of hemp, kind of where we started with the 2014 Farm Bill, to separate true grain and fiber hemp production from cannabinoid hemp. And so, there really is no difference between hemp and marijuana other than that imaginary number or not imaginary, it's a real number, but where did it come from? And why did they decide on that 0.3 number, which defines them legally as different entities, but it's the same plant. The cannabinoids are exactly the same botanically and molecularly. So I guess one of the advantages you could say is we've eliminated the production of marijuana by limiting the actual volume of plants in a field to be hemp plants and low THC.
Winter, did you want to follow up on that?
I think that's a great point, Tony. And you'd mentioned earlier too a little bit about Delta 8, and I think that's also significant, and in part maybe what they're talking about in the question as well, the difference between Delta 8 and Delta 9. And I will say, when I came to Minnesota, I was like, what is Delta 8? Because I was coming from a state with legalized marijuana. So, and Delta 8 had a boom after the 2018 Farm Bill. So, if a state had legalized that in 2018 before it went into effect in 2019, nobody was going to be buying Delta 8. So, learning about that has kind of helped me see a little bit more about even just how this product is still the same. And I think that's a big misconception, even within the consumer end of it, where I've talked to some people who have never tried a product like this, and they don't realize they're going to get as affected by it as they do, because it's hemp derived, and that terminology can be, a problem when you're going about, trying something new that is intoxicating. So, I mean, and to your point too, just because it's derived from a plant that has 0.3% THC doesn't mean that the gram amount or milligram amount isn't still 5 milligrams in a piece. So I think that might be an important point for people when they're actually going out and buying that product.
Yeah, and the Delta 8 came about primarily because for a big reason, because hemp produces a high amount of CBD when you extract it, and there was a glut of CBD left over after the sort of pot at the end of the rainbow rush for, everybody was getting into hemp for CBD production. And in about 2018, I think that was our highest license year. There was a lot of CBD left over, and that can be converted back to Delta 8. And that's essentially what was going on. But we're beyond that. And that's the other thing, is that we've got people, and especially consumers, and I don't know if Jason could comment on this. There's so many derivatives now of THCs, and then things that aren't considered, they're considered hydroxy, and not technically tetrahydrocannabinols. And it's like, where does all of this fall? They're still intoxicating. Well, what does intoxicating mean? There's a big kind of mess out there to figure out. But I think Allison said, like, well, what did we do, and what was the purpose of this earlier? I think it was a way forward for something to happen, or we would have just kept spinning our wheels, because we got to fix some things, and I think Jason would agree with that. But if we wouldn't have made this first step, we're never going to come up with the perfect law right out of the bat. So, we'd still be here talking about, well, why can't I do something else than grain and fiber?
That's a good point, Tony. Do you agree with that, Jason? Did we need to just do something to get moving?
Well, yes, I think, there definitely is opposition in the legislature from Republicans. And I think perhaps some of them saw this as a baby step forward. I can tell you that this law came about initially to try to do away with the Delta 8 vapes in particular. There were health concerns about that because it was completely unregulated. And there was a couple of years ago, people were going to the hospital because they had been vaping these black market vapes. So for all intents and purposes, this law has done away with vapes. So, we're left now with gummies and drinkables, beverages, of course, which I think a lot of people view as safer and healthier than vapes. The one thing we haven't talked about is that because this is hemp is legal throughout the country. The federal farm bill in 2018 legalized it. So that's another quirk of our market here. So we have obviously some Minnesota business owners here, but there are out-of-state players shipping their products into Minnesota. And that simply doesn't exist in adult use marijuana states where the border is a brick wall. You can't have interstate commerce with adult use marijuana because of the federal implications. So that's another quirk of our system.
I know that is something definitely on Tom's mind. And I know, Tom, that you've dealt with that as far as being a brewer and the laws around beer and alcohol. Can you talk a little bit about what the differences are between THC beverages and beer and just what your experience has been with Indeed? Make sure you unmute.
Classic. Yeah, we've been doing alcohol for 10 years now, and very familiar with all the laws, regulations, and everything from state level to federal level, and even local level requirements. The interesting thing is, THC in all respects is an intoxicant, depending on how much you consume of it, same as alcohol. But in this current situation, we really have none of the regulation that you would see like in alcohol, other than the age requirement. But as far as like where it can be sold, when it can be sold, who can make it, what are the requirements to make it, and things like that. And so as a business owner, as we've kind of ventured into it, it's been sort of nice having the experience in alcohol because we've borrowed a lot from alcohol in essentially creating our own, regulatory system at our brewery. Because if you only follow, at least for us, because we're so used to working in the alcohol business, if we only followed the law and we just said, well, we can do everything and anything now, we might be doing some things that would be a little bit different from what we would do with alcohol. So we've kind of borrowed things from the alcohol side of things. We've also looked to other states and what they've done with a more full-on adult recreational marijuana legalization to kind of create our own system. There's still tons of questions because, of course, we're a business and we want to explore new opportunities. We have a brewery in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for example. And we're talking here about how hemp is legal across the country, but does that mean I can take a Delta 9 beverage that I produced in Minnesota and then ship that across the state borders into Wisconsin to be sold, at my brewery in Milwaukee or to a distributor in Wisconsin? So we still bump into these things as we get kind of entrepreneurial. And same question I think recently is one of the big ones you're seeing is, can I serve this inside of my tap room, or can a bar owner serve this inside of their bar to a patron who wants to consume that, maybe instead of an alcoholic beverage? And it doesn't really necessarily say no if you kind of crack that can, but in alcohol, we have, very, very like longstanding alcohol liability insurance, and dram shop laws and all these things that say very specifically, like, what happens if you overserve a customer and they leave and they injure someone as a result of that comes back at you. But with THC and cannabis, it's just not so clear. So everybody's kind of just exploring on their own and deciding what they're comfortable with risk-wise. Yeah.
Yeah, Jason, any thoughts any legal advice that you would give Tom? Indeed?
Well, I have two thoughts. So again, our law is unique because you notice we're not calling this food. These edible cannabinoid products, the statute's very careful not to ever call it food, because if you call it food, then the Federal Drug Administration, the federal FDA says you can't infuse food with cannabinoids. So, you know, a little wordplay here, but you know, I think the federal government has shown that when states act on cannabis, when they pass a new law, they leave you alone primarily. So, you know, we might be getting a little cute with the way we're calling this, but they're going to leave our market alone. And I would say that law doesn't necessarily exist in Wisconsin, so you might run into some issues there. And one other point, the irony here is that liquor stores, obviously, who might be the best equipped to be selling this stuff, they're used to carding people, to making sure you're of age, they're used to handling alcoholic beverages. That's one of the only places you can't sell these products. So I'm certain that will be a topic of conversation at the legislature. I've already met with some lobbyists who are interested in taking that up, because honestly, that seems like maybe a market that should be open to these products.
Yeah, and I just really quick agree with that. And it's interesting because they're not prevented from selling it because of this law. They're prevented because the law says that liquor stores can only sell a very specific list of products. So for many years, liquor stores sold lemons and limes, for example, even though they weren't supposed to, because they weren't on the list of products. And then in the last couple of years, it was permitted for a liquor store to sell lemons and limes, so you can go home and make your cocktail. And you know, THC beverages, for example, are not on that list. So they really should be treated the same as lemons and limes. Of course, nobody cared about lemons and limes 2 years ago, but now everybody's up in arms if a liquor store is carrying a THC beverage. Despite, the fact that I think they're a great place. Anybody who purveys alcohol is a good spot to sell it, because they are so used to following the rule when it comes to 21 plus and other enforcement and everything else. So.
One more follow-up for you, Tom, while we're on the topic. So where is Indeed currently selling its THC beverage?
Yeah, I mean, we are selling it in our tap room in Minneapolis, both to go and also a kind of a, I just described it as sort of a low-key way. We will serve it on site for consumption on site. We sell it to a number of our beer wholesalers who are carrying the product and then distributing it out to, this is where it gets interesting, is like just about everybody. And I know that there are liquor stores that are carrying THC beverages and just have not been, slapped on the wrist for it essentially yet. I mean, there was at the state fair, I don't know if you go to the state fair in St. Paul, I certainly do. And if you ever are walking in on Como Avenue near Snelling, there's usually people selling like bottled water and things like that. Well, this year there were like literally tents set up, pop-up tents with people selling THC, including Indeed Too Good was there underneath the tent. Like, I couldn't believe it, and that's our distributor had sold it to somebody who was just posted up outside the state fair. So everywhere and anywhere for the most part, and then also nowhere at the same time. It's really interesting. Yeah.
Wow, bizarre times. Nicola, tell us what it's been like for Verist, where you're selling direct to consumer. Talk about your products and how it's going now.
Yeah, I mean, Tony kind of touched on it. We are growing our own hemp. We've actually been part of the program since early 2019, growing hemp here on the farm in Eden Prairie. And one kind of difficulty that we've had is with this new law, having hemp-derived THC, not being able to grow a more high THC content traditional marijuana plant is not efficient. It's like making lemonade with 10,000 lemons versus 4 lemons. So from a resource perspective, we're using more land, we're using more seeds, we're using more labor, we're using more resources. So that has been something that we're hoping that the legislature will look at a little bit more closely from a growing and agriculture perspective. As far as our products go, we have been traditionally D2C. We've been picked up, for instance, Patina picked us up in their stores. So they're now selling gummies on site, which is, wonderful. And like Tom mentioned, you really can sell them anywhere besides the liquor stores, which I agree with both Tom and Jason, doesn't totally make sense because they are more equipped to probably sell this product more than most places. But from a marketing perspective, that's been difficult because a lot of the marketing companies, whether it's Meta or Clear Channel or iHeartRadio, will not let you advertise with them. If it has anything to do with hemp or cannabis or shows a hemp plant, you can't advertise. So I recently saw that a tobacco distributor had a big billboard on Highway 7, and it was advertising tobacco, and in tiny little letters underneath it said, plus edibles, you know, kind of inferring, of course, that they were selling the hemp-derived THC. And I thought, well, that's a creative way to get around it. But being kind of what our brand is, whether it's the Sievers, you know, Family Farm, or now Verist, we're very particular on how we present ourselves. We didn't do Delta 8. We wouldn't have. We didn't think that that was a great product to get into. And so we're really just going to see what happens in November. Still stick with D2C and some certain retailers here in the metro that we think fit our brand quite well, and see what happens in January when the legislature comes back to session.
You've hit on a bunch of things that I want to dive into a little more, but before we do that, Winter, I know you're picking up on some questions really about the basics. If we can kind of go back even a little further, do you want to frame up the question that people still have?
The question that keeps popping up is sort of the hemp versus THC versus cannabis. We actually had this own question when we were talking about this event itself, when we were saying, should we call it a cannabis event or a hemp event? And it actually goes a little bit too into, the whole end of advertising as well. So I guess to break it down, so hemp and marijuana are both cannabis. And so I've heard from some farmers that they are actually having some trouble if they try to talk about their own operation on social media. It goes back a little bit to people's misunderstanding of what's what. So, you know, hemp is cannabis, but hemp is not marijuana. And then hemp also has now been defined within the last few years after the 2018 Farm Bill as any cannabis plant that's under 0.3% Delta 9 THC. Not Delta 8, Delta 9 THC. So that doesn't change the plant itself. It is a legal definition. It is still the same species. It is still cannabis. So as we're talking about THC, hemp, and cannabis, all of them still also encompass this topic of THC as well. It's just how much is in it and what is the legal definition around it.
Tony, do you maybe have like some a cheat sheet on all of that? Is there like a Cliff Notes version to make sense of it? Because it's almost like the more you know, the more confusing it is.
So because I'm a plant person, I'll give you the botanical. So cannabis is cannabis sativa. If you go to Colorado or other even countries, they'll say, oh, there's indica and there's rutarellus, there's other species. The international botanical nomenclature, which research scientists like I would go by, has to go by what that is. So it's cannabis sativa. Those are other varieties that are produced, but cannabis sativa is cannabis. Hemp is a legal definition in law. As a regulator, it's either hemp or it's marijuana, which is a second definition in law. Marijuana is a controlled substance in the United States. Hemp is not. As Jason mentioned, it is federally legal. The problem we run into is people think that the Farm Bill, which legalized hemp, and now the resulting hemp laws somehow define hemp products. They really don't. They refer to them, but everything goes back to the definition of hemp, okay, which was intended to be for the plant. And you know that, you can tell that if you're a botanist by looking at the definition. It says 0.3% by dry weight. That is a measurement of a plant. That is very common, what we would do in any type of plant measurement, because plants are mostly water. So by removing the water, then you could tell what the concentration of THC is. People are now applying that as our legislators. They've done it to this new law, which drives me crazy, because sending something to a lab that's in a gummy form or a cookie or a tincture and saying, oh, let's figure out what it is by dry weight, is not a representation of what that actual cannabinoid is going to have on your body. So the simple form here, folks, is that it's all cannabis, okay? It's the same genus and species. The definitions legally are either hemp, which, Winter described the definition of 0.3% or below, or marijuana, which is anything above that. And those all have to do with laws and regulation. So the cannabinoids that come out of cannabis are obviously THC, CBD, and almost 100 more. And they're the same in hemp that they are in the definition of marijuana. It's just because it's the same plant. It's just that hemp is bred to produce, as Nicola pointed out, much less THC and higher amounts of CBD, and marijuana produces basically opposite amount. CBD and THC are basically companion cannabinoids in the plant. So when one is less, the other is higher. And I don't want to nerd out on you all and get into the biochemistry of it, but it's very confusing to people because you have products now too that people are calling, no, that's hemp. And what they're referring to is that 0.3 number. And it's, somehow we got to fix that, in my opinion, moving forward. And but in terms of the plant, they're the same thing. They produce the same cannabinoids. So,
Nicola, I wanted to just follow up with you as the grower in the room here, and just talk a little bit more. As you were saying, it just means more work to get to the same place than might be the case in another state. Talk a little bit more about how that plays out for you.
Yeah, I mean, we were excited when the Farm Bill passed. There had been a lot of hype about CBD in general. Of course, THC 10 years ago when Colorado legalized it, was big news. Obviously, then CBD came to be more relevant and more well-known, and we were excited about it. Really because we want to grow what people want. It doesn't matter if it's sweet corn, tomatoes, and now CBD, and of course hemp-derived THC. So as a family farm, that was exciting for us to diversify into. We quickly realized that the state didn't necessarily have the infrastructure like it does for field corn, soybeans, more of the traditional grain crops. And so a lot of farmers, I think, went into it treating it like Tony mentioned, like fiber, a different kind of crop like that, not realizing how specialized hemp and cannabis as a whole really is. And so that was a learning curve, one that we felt a little bit maybe more equipped to deal with just because of our experience growing sweet corn and tomatoes here on the farm. I would compare it for us and our experience much more like that versus field corn or soybeans. But we are hoping to have a more efficient process to get to those end products that the people in Minnesota want. And I'm not sure, like Jason said, we're happy that this is a step forward. I think everyone on this panel very much is in support of responsible regulation. We are definitely not only as a grower, but also of having products and the D2C model. And so it's a little bit of wait and see, but it's been a steep learning curve with more challenges than the average, I think, entrepreneur typically maybe faces in a different industry.
That's the understatement of the country, yes.
Well, Jason, can you expand on that a little bit? And I mean, is there any likelihood in the next session that we're going to see these issues addressed?
Well, I certainly, I hear what Nicola is saying about the frustration. Now you've got this market, right? We have this vast Minnesota market for these hemp-derived products. But like Nicola mentioned, I think that analogy is pretty apt, that you got to have like 10,000 lemons just to make one edible, because 0.3% Delta 9 THC isn't going to get you very far, and that's all you can have in the hemp plant. And the obvious solution there is just to legalize marijuana. Is that going to happen? I don't know. Ask me on November 9th when I see the composition of the legislature. But I think it's ironic because along with doing away with vapes, the health concerns with that, this law was also aimed at, again, putting Delta 8 out of business because there were concerns from Board of Pharmacy and from some of the legislators about the potential detrimental health impacts of Delta 8, even in gummies. Because to derive, I think a lot of people were deriving Delta 8 from CBD by using chemical solvents, and there wasn't really any knowledge about what the health impacts of that were. Well, I think what you're hearing now, and maybe Tom or Nicola can speak to this, or maybe even Tony or Winter, I think what we're seeing now is because Delta-9 THC appears naturally in such small amounts in hemp, they're doing the same thing. They're using these chemical solvents to extract Delta-9 from CBD. So have we really solved that problem, or have we just pushed the can down the road? I don't know. I mean, the legislature, this is a tough thing to get right. And like I said, I'm certain there's going to be more attention on this next session.
That sounds likely. Tom, I'm curious for you, you're not growing, you've got to buy the THC, right? What has that process been like, and how complicated is that?
Yeah, it's that one's not a guy underneath a tent at Snelling and Como. But it's interesting. I mean, there were a lot of people kind of laying in wait with plans to sell these types of things. I think some of them were, participating in the CBD and Delta-8 industry beforehand. We've partnered at least partially with a local supplier who's doing extraction, and they produce the emulsion basically per our order. That's a water soluble emulsion of THC, and there's a lot of testing going on. There's both testing on their end where we're sending out they're sending out the emulsion and providing a certificate of analysis for what's in it, both content of THC, content of CBD, whether it be Delta-9, Delta-8, to show that, hey, it's Delta-9, and also testing for any sort of contaminants, heavy metals, pesticides, et cetera. So at the same time, there are, like Tony mentioned earlier, there are people from outside the state of Minnesota that are essentially looking at this market, both as suppliers of ingredients like THC emulsions, and but also companies that produce THC products in other states or provinces or territories that want to have their products made here or find a way to ship them in. So that's been sort of eye-opening in the sense that, cannabis has been legal and THC has been legal in Colorado for 10 years at that adult recreational level. There's a lot of big business has been built up in that. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of really smart people working in it. Same in California, and those people are starting to kind of have conversations in the state of Minnesota. And like I said, indeed, we're mainly just learning a lot about what to look for in the people who are supplying us these types of ingredients, what kind of questions, other questions to ask. And then, also, I think there'll just be more and more options and more competition. So far, it does seem like the competition isn't about what's the lowest price, especially on like this kind of manufacturing side of things. At least from Indeed's perspective, it seems like the conversation is what's the best quality? What is going to give our consumers the safest and highest quality experience of these products? Because if you look at these other states where this continues to evolve, if we go to this full-on adult legal level, I mean, the brands and the companies that win are the ones who bring the quality ultimately, because it's big business. And in this, it does feel a little cottage right now because everybody's kind of participating and all these sorts of things are going on, and you just don't really know what you're getting and where you're getting it from. But I think that's really going to change. And I think businesses like Indeed are really focused on that and that safety aspect and quality side of it.
Hitting on that safety and quality aspect of it, we actually have a question about the laws around packaging. I'm wondering, Tom, Nicola, could you tell us just a little bit about how do you package your product? What do you have to do before putting it out to market?
I'll let Nicola answer because she has such gorgeous packaging on her stuff. So
thank you. I appreciate that, Tom. I feel the same about Indeed. So there are, that is one thing that there is regulation around is packaging requirements. And so you need to put your address and where you're manufacturing on your label, as well as having, Tom mentioned it, a certificate of analysis. So all of our products, and same with Tom, really anyone in this industry that's doing it by the book, has a third-party certificate of analysis that is done showing exactly what is in that product, from a CBD and THC perspective, but like Tom mentioned, heavy metals, anything like that is going to show up on that COA, and that COA is attached to a batch number that you'll also see on the packaging. So from a consumer perspective, it's important to not only be educated on that, but to know what to look for when shopping for a product. And, Tom mentioned competition. It is, I think, and Jason's point too, to go to an adult use, I think would help Minnesota businesses because you're not going to see kind of an onslaught of products coming from out of state that, coming, for instance, from Michigan, where it's legal, or Illinois or Colorado, where they're producing these products much more cheaper than we are here in Minnesota. You can't compete with that. So it's just, it would help us, I think. And like Jason said, there's a way to do it right. It's not going to be right exactly the first method that we go with. But I think it is important to move towards it because it allows for a regulatory board, protecting Minnesota businesses, and just more transparency as a whole.
Good point. There's another question that somebody posed, and it was one of my follow-up questions for you as well, Nicola, about the marketing piece. You were talking about the struggle. Being a direct-to-consumer brand is one of the, today it's like everybody knows how to do that, right? And it's become so commonplace, and yet here you are struggling because you're hitting on all of these different regulations, some archaic, some not. I know our own media company in the magazine business, we're discussing what are the lines, what can we do, what will we accept. Talk a little bit more about your experience, and then Jason and Tony, maybe you can follow up with what the law is, and do we need to make changes there in terms of marketing of CBD, THC products?
Yeah, so our challenge thus far has been, some of those traditional marketing methods like Google and Meta. I mean, that's especially what we use for our Seavers brand, is very difficult to get into. You've got basically AI that's flagging your ads, depending on if, like I said, if it shows hemp, cannabis, if it redirects to a hemp website, it will get pulled. Now, interestingly enough, we have found, like, for instance, if you're Martha Stewart and you're willing to spend millions with Facebook, those ads will get through. Obviously, Varus is not at that level, maybe one day, but not thus far. And the conversations that we've had locally, at least thankfully, seem open-minded. It's a not now, not a never. So I think that's important, as Tony mentions regulation, and Jason, of really understanding what the law is, because I can't go to another business owner and say, hey, take this risk with me, if they're not totally comfortable, and I want to always respect that. So again, I think furthering regulation is going to be helpful as a whole, even just from a marketing perspective. So TCB or iHeartRadio can say, yes, we understand the law and we can advertise, or we can't, or we're going to relook at it in a year. Having some of that knowledge, I think, would be helpful.
Is there, Jason, do you know, I mean, is there a black and white law that says that you can or can't advertise these products, or is it really up to the media outlet?
No, actually, the statute that legalized all this stuff is pretty specific about what you can't market to children. You can't call it, THC Fruit Loops, or have animal caricatures and things like that. And that, combined with the childproof packaging, obviously with the adult use requirement, I mean, we did some little things to keep this out of children's hands. I think we can go further, and it's not anything we can't handle. There is an adult use marijuana legalization bill that was passed by the DFL controlled House a few years ago. Even if we don't pass adult use marijuana, we can pull the pieces out of that bill, which is a massive 800-page bill. There's a licensing requirement. We can pull that. We can pull the cannabis control board piece out of that. We can pull the tax piece out of that and really beef up the enforcement provisions of this law, because right now, the regulatory body in charge of this is the Board of Pharmacy, which is fewer than 24 employees. They can't be out policing this. And this law has not done away with the black market. These products were on the shelves before. They're on the shelves now. And now they're competing with people trying to do the right thing, like Tom and Nicola, complying with the law, but now they're competing with the black market, and that's not fair. And that's not a safe way to run a market. We need to do away with the black market so consumers can rely on these products and know that they're safe.
Tom, how, as far as the marketing piece goes, I mean, I know you got a fair amount of publicity when you launched your THC beverage, but how are you marketing it? Are you?
Yeah, we run into the same problems that have been mentioned here, which is, you put up something on Instagram, it's immediately taken down. you can kind of market a little bit through code words and emojis. That's what we've found. But otherwise, it really is word of mouth. It is, our tap room and our Minneapolis tap room at the brewery here has always been kind of one of our biggest marketing, assets for us. We have, about 200,000 individual people come through our tap room a year. And so we can put whatever signage up inside there as we'd like to. And it's primarily an adult oriented place. It's not that people don't bring their kids there, and we're not trying to market THC products to the kids when they show up with their parents, but that's kind of really it. And obviously getting in other stores, but you won't be seeing an Indeed THC billboard anytime soon. And I think that again, is kind of like Jason's saying, that look to other states and how they've created a nice kind of organized system so that people know where to go and purchase their legal THC cannabis products. And there could be a set of places. It could be different here than it's done in other places. When you go to a lot of those places in Colorado or California, it's an experience where the marketing happens within the store. The store is doing the work to kind of curate the selection. They know sort of what their customers are and what they like. And they're working with the people who are producing these products, and you come in and you get to choose and find what you're looking for in kind of the wide array of options that there are, and especially in that full recreational adult cannabis consumption world. And so right now, the black market is still strong. And you see states where they go too far with tax, or they go too far with regulation on the recreational level, and the black market continues to go strong. And there are other states where there's a lot less of it because they've done a good job, I think, finding the right mix and the right balance of things where people get access. They know what it's about. They can get information. They can go get the right, affordable price for what they're looking for, the right value, we'll call it. So hopefully we'll see some change there to kind of open it up and make it easier.
Okay, so if each of you got to pass one amendment or new law this session, okay, you each have one pass, what is it going to be? What would make a significant difference for, clearing all this up and minimizing the black market, as you mentioned? Tom, do you want to start?
Well, I think hopefully my choice wouldn't be then sort of implemented the same way as we've done this, but I mean, I would get rid of the hemp requirement. I would go with, basically a market similar to Colorado or California. And I think, that obviously needs to be probably an 800-page bill at least, with lots of things. But I think Minnesota can absolutely do it. We've done big things like that in the past, and we can look to other states for guidance there, what's been successful. So,
Tony, speaking from the inside, what would you do? You're in charge. You're got all the expertise. What change would you make?
Well, I think I'll punt it to everyone else. I can't make legislative comments like that, but I can follow up at the end if you can circle back.
Nobody's listening, Tony. It's okay. Your bosses won't know. Okay, we won't put you on the spot. Nicola, we'll go to you next.
I would second Tom in pretty much everything he said from a growing perspective, and I probably sound like a broken record. I think the ability to be growing, traditional marijuana, the high THC cannabis plant would be probably my number one. That would really make a difference for our business.
Okay, Jason.
Well, obviously, I'm a legalization advocate, so I want full legalization, full adult use legalization, which, by the way, every adult use state, teen use goes down because it's harder for kids to get. Sorry, that's my little plug. I can guarantee you that Anthony Cordelet at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture is happy to have this hot potato off of his lap, because 6 months ago, he would have been fielding all these complaints. Now it's the poor board of pharmacy. So if I could wave a magic wand, I said this before, we need a cannabis management board, a fully funded board that can develop some institutional expertise on managing these products, because it's complicated, it's confusing, it's hard. We need some expertise. I would love to turn the Office of Medical Cannabis into that board, because Chris Tolkis over there, the director, she does a great job. She would be a great director of that program.
Very good.
I can give
go ahead.
I can give my 2 cents then. It won't be about what I think the legislature will do, but one thing I want to point out is, well, there's 2 things. One, there is referencing the other states that have done this. And I know I'm the bureaucrat in the room speaking to a bunch of entrepreneurs who probably hate government and excess, but it costs money to regulate, and we don't have any money in this state right now for hemp regulation. There's myself and one other person who's my hemp coordinator. Depending on the year, we do charge a lot for licenses to run the program, but it doesn't bring in, it's a wash, right? It doesn't bring in revenue. So that needs to change in Minnesota. Number two, you know, the problem with getting rid of the hemp regulation for, or the hemp side of it for some growers is going to be, it comes with federal legal protection, comes with the ability to bank, and FDIC banks officially. You're not seeing that with marijuana companies in Colorado. You can't get insurance for your crops. You know, you can now for hemp. There are some benefits to some folks that aren't going to want to switch over. So I just point that out because although I do agree with Tom and Nicola in terms of, yeah, it really hurts their ability to succeed, you know, but there are some benefits that it just depends on what you're looking to do. So I could see a world where, to Jason's point, the board now has all the regulation over these products, but I could see a world where we pass adult use cannabis and, you know, programs like mine are still able to license all the growers, help those growers, regulate them. We have that expertise. It's just right now, as again, bureaucrats, we can't do anything without authority, which comes in statute and guides us as to what, you know, we're going to do. So we do need the legislature to do something in order to get that all worked out. And Jason's point about a central controlling entity is absolutely needed.
We're not trying to put you out of a job, Tony, that's for sure.
Yeah,
Maybe evolve it.
We'll still have plenty to do.
There is one very detailed question, Tony, that will allow you to nerd out just a little bit. This one feels destined for you. If anyone else wants to take a stab, by all means, go for it. Andreas has been waiting patiently with this question. Does a myotoxin test satisfy the new mold testing requirement?
Yeah, so myotoxins are produced by molds, right? And legislators get confused when they try to go with subject matter experts, but when things get drafted and before they go through the revisor and become an actual bill and pass, a lot of times they'll write things like you need to test for fertilizer. Well, you can't test for fertilizer. What you can test for is heavy metals. So why put fertilizer in the testing requirement? Just put heavy metals in. You don't really need to test for mold because what you're concerned about are myotoxins. Yes, molds may be in your product, but until they produce the myotoxins, which are harmful, you may just have mold, right? Well, nobody wants mold, but you know, technically, is it harmful or not? Will it satisfy a test? That's another problem people don't understand. You can't just take a product, run off to a lab and say, here's my whatever, tell me, here's what the statute says, tell me, run a test on all of that. They need to know what pesticides you've applied or that you're concerned about so that they can test for those pesticides. There's no magical test where they put it into a Star Trek computer and it comes out and says, here's the pesticides that were there. And that's a big problem. I'm being somewhat facetious here, but all this statute is being passed by folks that want testing to ensure public safety, but people need to understand that drives the labs crazy. They can only test for certain things. I'll give you an example. Right now in the new law, it allows for 5 milligrams per serving or 50 milligrams per package of any THC. So that's any tetrahydrocannabinol, not just Delta-9, anything that's considered a THC. Most of the only accredited lab that I know of right now, 1725 and ISO certified for cannabis in the state right now, can only test, they have a panel for Delta-9, THCA, which is the acid equivalent, and Delta-8, okay? So THCO, THC, you know, Delta-12, Delta-10,
Delta-10.
they can't test for all those. So a product could technically have 5 different THCs in it, and they can only measure the 2. Well, if a company knew about that, And let's say they weren't, Nicola or Tom's company that are trying to do it right. And believe it, on my side of things, I see the companies that are doing it wrong. They could stick one of those other psychoactive properties in there, and it brings now your 5 milligrams above, and it can get somebody sick that thinks, hey, I'm taking 5 milligrams of THC, I should be safe. That's where we really need that regulation. So I know I went beyond the mycotoxins, but it's a complicated issue to just answer that in general. You need to know what type of mold you're dealing with so they can test for the specific mycotoxins that it puts out.
I knew you would have an answer, Tony. Thank you. That was really helpful. Okay, here's one that is maybe a little more general for all of you. What advice would you give to other entrepreneurs right now? I know there are many listening who would love to be in this space. Everybody thought, oh, this is going to be the big windfall. This is our opportunity to get in business in Minnesota. If someone is thinking of starting some sort of THC related, launching a product, getting in, what would you tell them to do, Tom?
I would start by, at this current moment in time, I would be careful about how much you invest, especially if any of that investing was going to be sort of aspirational for certain changes to happen. Because what we have right now is we have the law as it is, and we don't know which way it's going to go. And that's kind of the same thing Tony's talking about. Like there's like one lab in the state that's doing kind of enough, but not quite really. And because nobody wants to plunk down all the money right now to put a lab in when you're like, what's going to happen? So I would tread sort of carefully. That being said, if like things continue to progress in the right way, like it looks very promising from a business perspective. We kind of mentioned like this idea of funding like an organization to manage and regulate the industry in the state. Like right now, these products are not being taxed other than sales tax at the retail level. And it's kind of crazy because there's not an infinite amount of room to put the tax on these products, but for the most part, people who are producing the products are essentially selling them as though they have tax in them and capturing that additional profit, because we're all prepared for the fact essentially of like, when will it be taxed? So there's room, I think, in it. I think and indeed, we're being very careful. We're not running out and buying brand new specialized equipment to make THC beverages. We're using the equipment we already have, and we already have a whole business that is much larger than our THC business that helps us kind of do this. So
good advice. Nicola, what about you? What would you tell another new business or would-be business wanting to get into this space?
I would say, do your homework and your research to the best of your ability. This is not a traditional business space. We've learned over the last hour a lot of the different challenges. Our family has started a lot of different businesses over the last 130 years, and this has probably been the most challenging. And I second Tom. We are not going out and spending a ton of money on infrastructure and capital inputs. We are kind of having the model of this is slow to grow. Again, similar to Tom, we're using our other businesses to kind of subsidize this business and get it off the ground. But I think, one positive aspect is I do think those people in Minnesota that are focused on quality and complying and doing it right, it's a small community and it's very complementary of one another. Yes, it's competitive, of course, but there's a really good community there. So that is one positive from it. But it's definitely been more challenging, I think, than we anticipated.
Yeah, I think I'd second that again. And one last piece too, if I could add on top of that, is if you look forward and let's say things continue to progress, I mean, there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands of entrants into this space. And if you look to other states, like there won't be hundreds and thousands of them that succeed. And so if you look at kind of the common threads of what makes them successful, it seems to be great brands, high quality, consistency, following the rules, all of those things. And so I think that's where I would encourage everybody to look as well. And that's kind of what Nicola is saying as well. So yeah.
Makes sense. Jason, best piece of advice for businesses, for entrepreneurs?
Oh, well, first you got to get a good lawyer, of course, right? No. Well, I don't want to repeat what other people are saying, but this is not the time. This is not the field for you if you're not going to pay attention to politics, because Tom, I guarantee you were paying you were paying attention to what was happening with your lobbyists, who did a fantastic job, by the way. And if you're not paying attention to what's happening politically, you're just not going to know what's coming down the pike next. So, a lot of people are allergic to politics. I get it, but man, this whole market is so tightly wound up with what's happening in the legislature and the governor's office, and frankly, even City Hall. I mean, you've had cities throughout the state passing these moratoriums. I mean, get to know your city council people, get to know your mayor. They're going to be your friends. Introduce yourself to the local police department, right? Because you are in a criminal adjacent industry, right? You've crossed that line from hemp into marijuana. Well, you don't necessarily want to be on this side. So yeah, be careful. Do your homework, as Nicola said, but you got to pay attention to what's happening in politics, because it's so intertwined.
Wise words. We try to help with that at TCB Mag. Tony, are you allowed to give a piece of business advice or just a recommendation?
I actually, my first thing I had a note written down was get a lawyer. I tell a lot of people that there's a lot to learn here. Between a number below 0.3 and above 0.3, it's a very different world, and you need to take it seriously. We tell a lot of our growers to get with or reach out to people like Nicola or Tom who are doing this and aren't investing, the moon into this and going for broke. Start small, all those things I've heard. The number one thing I haven't heard said is be very cognizant of who you're talking to. I'm sure a lot of the folks on here are entrepreneurs, and they've dealt with people that have tried to sell them, everything under the sun. There's been so many charlatans come and go. Out of everyone in the cannabis space, I started on this hemp journey back in 2010, and I've met everybody that's come through with a promise, and it really upsets me because we're trying to defend farmers. Yes, we regulate them because the state has put us here to do that, and they say we have to, but we want to see them succeed. And there's nothing that bums me out more than farmers across the board, whether they're small or large, are hurting. Expenses are high, management costs are high, whether you're organic or you're small or large, whatever. The last thing you need is somebody trying to swindle your money out of you. And that has happened a lot. The genetics in this industry are ridiculous. Just to be honest with you, being a plant person, you would never have a variety developed in 2 or 3 years. And then on top of it, have someone sell you that for $1 a seed. We need a lot of honesty. And I think Tom hit it on the head. Eventually we'll get there, because Colorado doesn't have the number of people that started back in 2012 or so, when they passed their legalization law for cannabis, still standing. A lot of those companies washed out, and the ones that were honest and were providing good products survived. So if you want to get there, that I believe is a marathon, not a quick sprint. And I hope that anybody that's new getting into this, you do your homework, because there are people out there that'll take your money, and they'll put you in bad situations, and you're going to need to hire Jason.
Right. Well, thank you for that perspective. And speaking of doing your homework, I hope you'll all take a look at the fall issue of Start-MN. That's TCB's entrepreneurship focused, startup focused magazine. It's on its way to subscribers now. We also have a preview of winter's cover story online now, and it's all about the hemp law and what it means, really focusing specifically on the ag side and new opportunities for a new generation of farmers. Winter, any favorite insight that really sticks with you that you learned? You spent some time on a couple of Minnesota farms. What did you learn? What was your big takeaway?
I think actually one of the big takeaways that we haven't touched on too much was just the amount of infrastructure we already have in place for hemp, not because of the cannabinoid end, but because of industrial hemp. Back in World War II, the federal government actually sponsored 11 processors in the state. So we have good soil for hemp, but it's not just used for THC, even though that seems to be the demand right now that we're seeing so much, but it's also used for textiles. And I think we're going to see an increase in people looking for hempcrete. There's just so many different uses for it, food, all these different things. So, I mean, I think it is important to keep in mind that it's a whole plant. It's not just the female plant. It's also, all of these other pieces of it. So I think the industry might expand outward beyond just the THC end, even though that part's kind of fun.
Winter's doing some great coverage, if I do say so myself. Thank you, Winter, and be sure to check out her story at tcbmag.com. She quotes a couple people right here that you're listening to today. We thank all of you so much. Nicola, Jason, Tom, Tony, you are true experts, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I am guessing this will be the first of many conversations as things evolve. Thank you all for joining us today. While we have your attention, just want to mention that we have another panel discussion, this one live and in person on November 16th. And again, it's about startups. We're going to talk about Minnesota's place in the startup economy. So join us for that. We've got another great panel. And then we end the year with our big Person of the Year and TCB 100 event on December 8th. So go to tcbmag.com/events, check it out, get registered, and join us, and keep talking to all the important people like the ones we have on our panel today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thanks especially to our panelists. Take care.